Hey everyone, today we're diving into 2 Samuel chapter 16, and wow, things are intense. David has just left the palace, Absalom has taken over, and there's this crazy mix of family tension, betrayal, and power struggles happening. It's messy, emotional, and full of lessons about loyalty, critics, and God's providence. So grab your Bible or your phone, settle in, and let's walk through this story together. You're not going to want to miss the twist in what happens next. Okay, so before we jump into chapter 16, let's just take a moment to catch up on what went down in chapter 15, because honestly, it sets the stage for everything that's about to happen, and it's kind of a mess. So David, our king, has this son, Absalom, right? And there's a ton of tension between them. Part of it goes way back. Absalom had killed his half-brother Amnon because Amnon raped their sister Tamar. And David, for whatever reason, didn't really punish Amnon or even really reconcile the situation. That left a lot of bitterness brewing. Absalom, of course, was fuming, and David, in his own way, carried some resentment too. So you can imagine, the family vibe wasn't exactly peaceful. It was strained, awkward, and honestly, full of unspoken grudges. Anyway, time passes, and Absalom decides, hey, maybe I can do a better job than Dad. He starts this whole coup trying to take the kingdom for himself. And here's the weird part, David doesn't fight him. Instead, he just leaves the palace. He vacates. It's almost like he throws up his hands and says, okay, you want the throne? Fine, take it. It's not like David is weak or doesn't know how to fight. He was a warrior, after all, but something about his heart being heavy with guilt. Past sins and family strife makes him step back. It's a strange mix of tenderheartedness, fatigue, and maybe even a sense of resignation. Now, while David is leaving, he's not alone. Some of his closest friends stick with him, which is super important because, as we'll see, tough times really do reveal who's genuine and who's not. One friend, Hushai, proves his loyalty by staying with David even when the odds are against them. Meanwhile, others, like Ahithophel, who used to be a trusted counselor, switch sides and join Absalom. That's the painful part. You realize that in moments of crisis, some people show their true colors, and David learns this the hard way. But here's the thing, these betrayals, as heartbreaking as they are, also highlight the ones who are real, the friends who stick through thick and thin. To back up a bit, we have to remember the bigger picture. This family drama isn't just random, it's tied to David's earlier sins and the consequences that ripple through his household. His sin with Bathsheba, for instance, set off a chain of events that led to long-term strife within the family. It's like this heavy shadow hangs over the palace, affecting every relationship, every decision, every interaction. And in chapter 15, we see how those past choices compound with current events, making things messy and complicated. It's a lesson in how unresolved sin, unaddressed resentment, and lack of accountability can snowball into bigger problems. So, we're at this point where David, feeling the weight of all this, decides to vacate the palace. He doesn't resist Absalom's takeover. And the story here really highlights two things. First, how human emotions and past mistakes shape decisions. And second, how friends and allies can either lift you up or betray you when it matters most. It's this duality, loyalty versus betrayal, that's so fascinating because it shows how intertwined human relationships are with leadership and trust. And you start to see why David's journey is so complex. He's not just a king, he's a father, a man weighed down by personal failures, and someone navigating the treacherous waters of loyalty and betrayal. Meanwhile, Absalom isn't just plotting in secret, he's actively undermining David's reign, building support among the people, and showing himself as the new authority figure. He's charismatic, strategic, and frankly, ruthless when he needs to be. And in doing all this, he exposes the vulnerabilities in David's kingdom and in the hearts of the people. Some are quick to switch allegiances, while others hold steady, proving their loyalty. It's like watching a chess game, but with real people, real emotions, and very high stakes. And that brings us to another point that chapter 15 makes clear. Tough times really do separate the wheat from the chaff when it comes to friendships. David learns who truly cares about him, who's willing to risk safety and comfort to stay by his side, and who's only there for themselves. That's huge because it's not just about political alliances, it's about trust, character, and the kind of people you want in your inner circle, especially when the world seems to be turning against you. So as we transition into chapter 16, keep all of this in mind. We have a king on the run, a son who's trying to take over, friends who are either betraying or defending him, and a family fraught with unresolved pain. It's a lot to unpack, but it sets the stage perfectly for what comes next. Chapter 16 is going to show us how David handles even more challenges, how loyalty and deception play out, and how God's providence starts to weave through these chaotic events. It's messy, emotional, and deeply human, but it's also full of lessons we can learn from today. Alright, before we dive into chapter 16, I want to pause for a sec and talk about something that really stands out in the story so far: friendship. Seriously, it's crazy how in the middle of all this political chaos, family drama, and betrayal, the concept of true friendship just jumps out. I mean, think about David. He's on the run. His son Absalom has just taken over. Some of his closest advisors have switched sides, and he's left questioning who he can really trust. And this is exactly where we can learn what makes a real friend. First off, loyalty. I mean, David's in a position where loyalty is tested like never before. Some people, like Ahithophel, were supposed to be loyal advisors, but they chose to betray him. Then there's Hushai, who sticks with David, even though it's dangerous and inconvenient. That's real loyalty. A true friend doesn't just hang around when it's easy. They stick with you when the world is literally turning upside down. Next, presence in a crisis. David's situation is, well, the definition of a crisis. His son wants his throne, he's left the palace, and danger is everywhere. Now, some of his friends could have stayed home, played it safe, but they show up, they stay with him, they support him. Sometimes it's just being there, right? Just being present without necessarily trying to fix anything. That's powerful. In fact, there's this moment in the story that reminds me of the Jewish tradition called sitting Shiva, where friends literally sit with someone who is grieving for 7 days, offering their presence as support. That's the kind of thing that matters in a friend. Then there's love. Real love. Proverbs 17:17 says a friend loves at all times, and we see that in David's loyal friends, they're not just strategic allies, they genuinely care about him. It's not transactional, it's not about what he can do for them. They love him even when he's down, even when things are messy, even when life is complicated. That's rare, isn't it? Keeping confidence is another huge part. A true friend isn't out there gossiping or spreading what you've shared in trust. Think about David's life. He's got spies, betrayers, and plenty of people who would love to twist the story for their own gain. The friends who stay loyal also know how to hold things confidentially. That builds trust, and in times like this, trust is everything. Honest confrontation is tricky, but so important. A real friend isn't just going to say yes to everything or flatter you. Sometimes they have to tell you the hard truths, even when it stings. And that's exactly the kind of counsel that can save you from bigger mistakes. It's not easy and it's not comfortable, but honesty in friendship is vital, especially when stakes are high. Then there's lifting up the fallen. We all stumble. And in this story, David's in a kind of wilderness, not just literally, but emotionally and spiritually. A true friend steps in to help you back up, to encourage you, to remind you that you're not alone. It's that act of support that keeps a person going when everything feels like it's collapsing around them. And finally, forgiveness. People will mess up. They will hurt you, sometimes unintentionally, sometimes not. A true friend forgives over and over because relationships aren't about perfection, they're about commitment, grace, and understanding. David's friends show that kind of steadfastness, forgiving, continuing to support him despite the messiness of life around them. When you step back and look at these 7 signs: loyalty, presence in crisis, love, keeping confidence, honest confrontation, lifting the fallen, and forgiveness, they're all alive in this story. And the amazing thing is, David's experience isn't just ancient history. It's real human stuff that we deal with today. It makes you think about your own friendships, right? Who's really loyal? Who shows up when you're in crisis? Who speaks the hard truth and lifts you up? Who forgives when you stumble? And here's the kicker, tough times. Like, David's revealed these qualities in people in a way that easy times never could. When everything's going right, it's easy to have friends around, but when the palace is gone, the power is lost and danger is near. That's when you really see who's there for you and who's not. It's messy, it's emotional, and it's real, but it's also a powerful lesson. So as we head into chapter 16, keep your eyes open for how these friendships play out, because they're going to teach us just as much as the big events with Absalom and the kingdom itself. Alright, so now we get into chapter 16, and the story really starts to unfold in a tense, almost cinematic way. David is leaving the palace, moving east, crossing valleys, and climbing over the Mount of Olives. He's exhausted, emotionally drained, and the weight of everything, the betrayal, the family strife, the threat from Absalom is pressing down on him. And then, out of nowhere, he encounters Ziba. Now, Ziba isn't just some random person. He's the servant of Embath, the grandson of Jonathan, David's best friend who's long gone. And Ziba comes rolling in with donkeys, food, wine supplies for David and his weary people. On the surface, it seems like a generous, thoughtful gesture. And I mean, who wouldn't appreciate that after a long, grueling escape? Right? So David naturally stops and asks Ziba, wait, what's all this? Why are these here? And Ziba starts explaining. He says, well, the donkeys are for your household to ride on, the bread and summer fruits are for your young men to eat, and the wine is for anyone who's faint or tired in the wilderness. You can almost picture David taking a moment, looking at his men, seeing their hunger and exhaustion, and thinking, okay, this is a good thing. But then he asks the next question, and where's your master, Embath now? Here's where it gets tricky. Ziba tells David that Embath is staying in Jerusalem, basically hoping to take advantage of David's absence. He claims that Embath believes the people of Israel will restore the kingdom to him because he's the grandson of Jonathan, the son of Saul. It's a classic manipulation. Ziba paints a picture where David's old friend's grandson is scheming to claim the throne now that David has vacated it. And here's the part that makes your eyebrows raise. David, maybe exhausted and a little emotionally spent, doesn't stop to investigate. He doesn't pause and ask, is this really true? Could Ziba be spinning the story? Nope. He just immediately responds, basically giving Ziba an executive order, all that belonged to Embath, the inheritance. Everything that had been promised to Embath is now yours. Just like that. David doesn't question it, doesn't verify, he just gives it away. And it's easy to see why someone might do that. He's tired. He's in the wilderness. He's trying to focus on survival and leading his people. But this moment, this reaction, sets up a really important principle that is timeless. Always investigate both sides of a story. Because here's the thing later on. As we find out, Ziba isn't being entirely truthful. He's spinning the story to make himself look good, and maybe even hoping to gain favor. Maybe hoping to gain some control over David's household by taking advantage of David's generosity and haste. If David had taken a moment to check, to see if Embath was really in Jerusalem, or what Embath himself thought about all this, he might have made a more informed decision. But instead, he acts on just one side, and that's a situation that any of us can relate to. How many times do we hear a story from one person, get convinced it's true, and act before hearing the full picture? It's easy to do, especially when emotions are running high or when we're worn down. Now, let's step back and look at David here, not to criticize him, but to really understand the human side of him. He's dealing with a lot. His son has just waged a coup. His closest friends have either abandoned him or are in uncertain positions, and he's physically and emotionally spent from fleeing Jerusalem. On top of that, he's trying to care for a whole group of people, making sure they have food and water and protection. It's a high-pressure situation, and in those moments, even the wisest people can make decisions they might regret later. And that's why this story is so relatable. It's not just ancient history, it's human behavior we all experience in some way. The interaction with Zeba also gives us a peek into the dynamics of power and manipulation. Ziba is clever. He knows how to present the story to make David feel both informed and generous. He frames Mbath as potentially disloyal, as if he's scheming while David is absent. And David, in a way, wants to act justly. He wants to reward or redistribute what's due, but he doesn't stop to verify, and that's the trap, acting too quickly on one version of a story without seeking the full truth. And it's such a simple yet profound lesson. It's like, you might think, well, I would never fall for that. But when pressure, exhaustion, and emotional stress hit, anyone can make snap judgments that later prove problematic. So the takeaway here is really about patience, discernment, and due diligence. Proverbs 18:17 actually nails it. The first person to present a case seems right until the other comes and examines it. In other words, there's always another side to consider. And this moment with David and Ziba illustrates that perfectly. David's generosity and impulsive decision are commendable in a sense. He's trying to be fair, but the lack of verification shows the risk of acting without hearing all perspectives. In real life, whether it's in leadership, friendships, or even daily conflicts, hearing both sides can prevent misunderstandings, injustices, and even manipulation. And one last thing, this isn't just about David being duped. It's about teaching us a principle for life. Situations will arise where someone presents a story, and it's easy to react emotionally or make a quick decision, especially when we're tired, stressed, or overwhelmed. But taking that extra step to investigate, to hear all sides, to pause and reflect, can save us from unnecessary mistakes. And it's even more powerful when you realize that the person giving one side might have their own motives, like Ziba, which aren't obvious at first glance. So as we move into the rest of chapter 16, keep this in mind. Watch how David navigates these challenges, how friends and foes appear in the wilderness, and how the principle of hearing both sides plays out. It's going to show us that discernment, patience, and seeking truth are not just ancient lessons, they're incredibly practical for life today. In decisions big and small. Okay, so after the whole Ziba situation, David and his people are still making their way east over the Mount of Olives, and the story takes another intense turn. Enter Shimei, a man from the family of Saul. Now, this guy isn't just waving hello or offering encouragement. No. Shimei comes out literally cursing David, throwing stones at him, and shouting accusations. He's yelling things like, "Come out, you bloodthirsty man, the Lord has brought all the blood of Saul's house upon you, and now your son has taken the kingdom." You can imagine the scene, dust flying, stones pelting, servants scrambling, David and his men weary from travel and heartbreak. It's tense, it's frustrating, and honestly, it would be infuriating for anyone. Abishai, one of David's mighty men, seriously. This guy is like the special forces of David's army, sees what's happening, and his first instinct is, well, to fight. He says to David, basically, let me go over there and take that guy out. He's cursing the king, and we can't just let this slide. And you can see where he's coming from. If you're under attack, the instinct to strike back is natural. You're hurt, angry, maybe even embarrassed, and someone has just publicly humiliated you in front of your own people. It's primal. We get it. But here's where David's wisdom and restraint really shine. Instead of reacting with violence, instead of letting anger dictate his actions, he tells Abishai, "What have I to do with you, sons of Zeruiah? Let him curse, for the Lord has told him to." Whoa, right? David chooses restraint. He basically says, I'm not gonna take this into my own hands. The Lord is my defender. He sees what's going on, and he'll take care of it. Think about that for a second. The king, the man who had led armies, who had fought countless battles, is now showing incredible self-control and trusting God to handle someone's criticism and hatred. It's profound because it's not just about being passive, it's about having faith that God is working, even in the face of public insult and danger. And here's the thing, it's really easy for us to look at David and think, oh, he's being too passive. But put yourself in his shoes for a moment. Your son has just staged a coup against you. Some of your closest advisors have turned against you. You vacated your palace. And now random people from the opposing faction are coming out to publicly insult and even attack you. Any normal reaction might be rage, retaliation, or fear. But David pauses. He chooses to see Shimei's cursing through the lens of God's plan. He recognizes that critics and haters may attack, but that ultimately, the Lord is the one who defends him. And that's a lesson that resonates beyond this story. Because in life, people will criticize us, speak against us, try to manipulate situations, or even act with hostility, and it's so tempting to respond in anger. But David shows that restraint, trust, and wisdom often matter more than instant reaction. As David and his men continue along the road, Shimei keeps up the cursing, following them along the hillside, throwing more stones, kicking up dust. It's almost like he's taunting them, testing their patience. And yes, the people with David, his attendants and mighty men, are getting weary. You can picture them breathing heavily, wiping dust from their faces, thinking, man, how long is this going to go on? It's exhausting on every level. But David doesn't let frustration push him into retaliation. Instead, he refreshes his men, helps them regain strength, and continues moving forward, allowing the Lord to handle Shimei. That's remarkable leadership because it's not about winning the moment, it's about trusting the bigger picture. What's so powerful here is the principle that critics, haters, or even those who speak falsely against us may attack, but we don't have to be consumed by it. David could have reacted violently. He could have punished Shimei immediately, but instead, he lets God's justice and timing work. And it's not passive weakness, it's active faith. He's choosing to rise above the personal insult, the fear, and the temptation to react, relying instead on God's wisdom and protection. This also shows us something about the nature of attacks and adversity. Often, when we're in a vulnerable place, like David in the wilderness, people come out of nowhere, saying things meant to provoke, humiliate, or intimidate. And that's exactly what Shimei is doing. He's taking advantage of David's weakened position, trying to get a reaction, maybe even hoping David's own men will falter. But David's restraint, his refusal to be provoked, neutralizes Shimei's attack. By choosing to trust the Lord, David turns a potentially dangerous situation into a display of wisdom and faith. And this moment also highlights a subtle but crucial aspect of leadership leading by example. David's men are watching. His response to Shimei isn't just about personal restraint, it teaches them something about faith, patience, and trust in God. Instead of reacting with anger, they see their leader relying on God. That's far more powerful than any immediate act of retaliation could have been. So as we reflect on this part of the story, the lesson is clear. We will face critics, haters, and people who speak against us, sometimes publicly, sometimes privately. And the natural instinct is often to strike back, to defend ourselves, to prove we're right. But David's example shows a different way: restraint, trust in God, and leaving ultimate justice in his hands. It's not easy, and honestly, it's something we all struggle with. But the story of Shimei cursing David reminds us that the Lord is our defender, and when we trust him, even the most venomous attacks can be handled wisely and peacefully. As we continue into chapter 16, keep this principle in mind: not every attack requires a reaction, not every insult needs a comeback, and sometimes the most courageous thing we can do is trust God to handle what we can't. David shows us that patience, faith, and restraint are not signs of weakness, they're signs of strength. Alright, now things really start to get intense in the story, and we're going to dig into the fascinating drama between Absalom, Ahithophel, and Hushai. This part of the narrative is like a chess match, full of strategy, loyalty, manipulation, and divine providence. It's not just about politics or war, it's about human motives, broken relationships, and God's subtle hand at work. So, picture Absalom on the throne of Jerusalem, or at least he's claiming it. He's young, ambitious, and frankly, a little blinded by the desire to prove himself over his father, David. He's surrounded by counselors, people who are supposed to advise him, and the first person he turns to is Ahithophel. Now, Ahithophel had been one of David's most trusted advisors, the kind of guy whose counsel was considered wise and almost unerring. He had an incredible reputation, so when Absalom asks him, "Hey, What should I do to secure my reign? He's expecting a top-tier strategic answer, and Ahithophel delivers in a way that is, well, chilling. Ahithophel's plan is immediate, ruthless, and precise. He says, send out 12,000 men tonight. Go after your father while he's weary and vulnerable. Strike him while he's exhausted, and you'll terrify his followers. The rest will flee, and you'll be the king. Wow, right? It's almost like a military manual for a coup. The strategy is solid from a purely tactical perspective. If you only look at it as a battle plan, it's brilliant. It's the kind of move that could end the conflict in one night. And Absalom, he thinks it's perfect. He's like, yes, this is exactly what we need to do. You can see his excitement, his eagerness to crush his father's faction before it even has a chance to respond. But here's the thing, Ahithophel's motives aren't just about wisdom or strategy. He has bitterness and resentment toward David. Remember, David had caused grief in Ahithophel's family in the past. He was personally aggrieved, and now he's willing to leverage that anger to influence Absalom. So while the plan seems brilliant on the surface, it's tainted with revenge. Now, this is where Hushai comes into the picture, and it's really clever. Hushai is David's loyal friend. Remember, and David had instructed him to stay in Jerusalem and act as a mole of sorts. Hushai is playing a dangerous game here. He has to appear loyal to Absalom while secretly working for David. So Absalom, discurious and wanting multiple perspectives, also asks Hushai for advice. Absalom presents the plan Ahithophel suggested and asks, do you agree? What do you think Hushai's response is masterful? He doesn't flat out oppose Absalom in a way that would raise suspicion, but he carefully undermines the plan by pointing out that David is not as weak as he appears. He highlights David's reputation as a mighty warrior, capable of rallying his men, and warns that an immediate attack might backfire. Hushai basically says, your father is stronger than you realize. If you strike now, it could be disastrous. You should gather all Israel, prepare fully, and go in force later. This strategy is brilliant for a few reasons. One, it buys David time to regroup. Hushai knows David is exhausted, but even in that state, he's still dangerous. Giving Absalom a false sense of caution prevents an immediate strike that could wipe David and his loyal followers out. Two, it introduces delay, which is exactly what David needs. And three, it masks Hushai's true allegiance. He speaks respectfully to Absalom, gives logical reasons why the attack shouldn't happen immediately, and makes it sound like it's in Absalom's best interest. From Absalom's perspective, Hushai is just being a wise counselor, so he doesn't suspect that Hushai is actually sabotaging his plan to protect David. Now, Absalom's reaction is interesting. At first, he is impressed by Ahithophel's advice. He sees it as clever, ruthless, decisive. But when Hushai presents his perspective, it seems to appeal to Absalom's caution and perhaps vanity. Hushai frames his advice in a way that praises Absalom's judgment, saying something like, you're the one who should lead because you're strong, capable, and admired by all Israel. You need to be strategic and gather all the forces before acting. It's clever. It feeds Absalom's ego while subtly steering him away from immediate action. And the rest of the elders of Israel agree with Hushai's advice, giving it the weight of collective wisdom. It's a brilliant manipulation, but for good in this case, because it's really God's providence at work. And this is where the divine element becomes fascinating. The text explicitly tells us that the Lord intended to defeat the counsel of Ahithophel in order to bring disaster on Absalom. In other words, while humans are making these decisions, God is orchestrating the outcomes in the background. David had prayed earlier, asking God to turn Ahithophel's counsel into foolishness. And now we see that prayer answered through Hushai's intervention. It's amazing how the narrative weaves together human action, loyalty, deception, and divine providence. Hushai's advice isn't just clever strategy, it's God's way of protecting David without direct intervention, using human relationships, loyalty, and cunning to achieve a greater plan. So, what we have here is a tension-filled moment. Absalom thinks he's receiving wise counsel from two sources, but the advice is motivated by completely different intentions. Ahithophel is bitter and wants revenge. Hushai is loyal and wants to protect David. Absalom, caught between the two, decides to follow Hushai's advice, thinking it's prudent, and in doing so, he unknowingly delays the attack that could have decimated David's group, giving David the chance to regroup and continue his journey safely. You can almost feel the suspense in this moment. The stakes are sky high. Every word spoken, every piece of advice given could change the fate of Israel, the life of David, and the outcome of the coup. And as we watch Absalom make his decisions, it's a vivid lesson about human motives and discernment. Not everyone who gives advice is loyal. Not everyone who looks like a friend has your best interests at heart. And yet, God can work through even ordinary human choices and relationships to accomplish his purposes. It's subtle, it's strategic, and it's almost cinematic in how all the pieces fit together. Hushai's strategy buys critical time for David, and that's no small thing. We're talking about lives on the line, loyalty tested, and a father's life literally hanging in the balance. David's trust in God, combined with the loyalty and courage of friends like Hushai, turns what could have been disaster into a situation that God can control. And it's not just a story about war or politics, it's about wisdom, discernment, and how God can work through people to fulfill his plans, even in messy, chaotic circumstances. As we reflect on this, the narrative invites us to consider our own lives. Sometimes we're like Absalom, eager to act, thinking we know best. Sometimes we're like Ahithophel, letting bitterness influence our advice or decisions. And sometimes we're like Hushai and called to act wisely, strategically, and loyally, even when it's risky. And through it all, God is at work, often unseen, orchestrating outcomes in ways we might not immediately recognize. That's a huge takeaway as we continue into the next sections. Loyalty, discernment, and trust in God's providence aren't just abstract ideas, they're practical, life-changing principles that play out in real human situations, just like this tense, dramatic moment in David's story. Alright, so after the high-stakes tension with Absalom and the advice from Ahithophel and Hushai, David and his small group of loyal followers are still on the move, trying to stay one step ahead of the chaos in Jerusalem. And here's where we really see the beauty of loyal friends and, honestly, God's providence in action. You've got David, emotionally and physically drained, his son's rebellion in full swing, his enemies surrounding him, and the desert and wilderness stretching out ahead. It's intense, and it's easy to imagine the fear and weariness settling in for everyone in the group. But then, even in the midst of all this, God provides. Let's focus on some key players here. Zadok and Ahimelech, two priests who are incredibly loyal to David, play a huge role. These guys don't just sit back and hope for the best they act. They risk their safety to support the king. And they do it discreetly, because if Absalom's forces discovered them helping David, it could have been fatal. We're talking about real courage here. So Zadok, Ahimelech, and a few others become messengers, moving in secret, delivering critical information to David and ensuring that he stays informed about what's happening in Jerusalem without being detected. Can you imagine that tension? Every step, every word could have life or death consequences, but they do it anyway, driven by loyalty, faith, and a genuine care for David. And it's not just them. There are others, everyday people who are faithful and brave in their own ways, who God seems to place exactly where they're needed. Think about it. David's group is exhausted, weary, hungry, and stressed. And then, at just the right moment, God sends individuals to minister to them, to encourage them, to provide for them. There's a timing here that's uncanny. It's almost like God is watching the wilderness like a chessboard and moving pieces into place at exactly the right moment. Beds, food, water, supplies, everything they need seems to appear when they're most vulnerable. It's a reminder that God doesn't abandon us, even when we feel most alone. And here's the thing, these acts of support aren't always flashy or grand. They're quiet, subtle, almost unnoticeable unless you're really paying attention. But for David and his followers, each act makes a difference. Someone shows up with bread and wine, not because they expect anything in return, but because they recognize need. They are exactly what's required at that moment. And you can almost feel the relief in David's camp, the weight lifting, even if only slightly, because they've been reassured that God hasn't forgotten them. Now, there's an important lesson here about timing and providence. God doesn't always deliver help in ways we expect. He doesn't always stop the challenges or remove the obstacles immediately. Instead, he provides support in ways that might be subtle or indirect, sometimes through people we don't even realize are instruments of his care. David's friends and supporters, though human and fallible, are used to minister at the perfect time. And this isn't just about physical sustenance, it's emotional, spiritual, and relational support, encouragement in the midst of exhaustion, reassurance in the face of betrayal, and presence in times of isolation. All of this matters, and all of it is God's provision through human hands. Take, for example, the way Zadok and Ahimelech maneuvered. They had to be clever, moving in secrecy, using intermediaries and safe houses. At one point, they would deliver messages to David without being detected, essentially acting as his eyes and ears in a city controlled by his enemies. And each successful delivery is not just a tactical win, it's a morale boost. David knows he's not alone, that God hasn't abandoned him, that there are people willing to risk their lives to support him. Can you feel the relief? It's like a small but critical lifeline in a sea of chaos. And then there's the way ordinary people come into play, bringing food, supplies, even just showing up with encouragement. God seems to have a sense of timing, placing exactly the right people along David's path when they're needed most. It's almost cinematic, isn't it? You can picture the weary group trudging along, unsure of the next step. And then someone appears with exactly what they need. Not too early, not too late, but just right. It's a powerful reminder that in our own lives, God often works through people around us, showing up through acts of kindness, support, and encouragement when we least expect it but most need it. And this isn't just about physical survival, it's about spiritual and emotional endurance. David is under immense stress, facing betrayal from his own son and from some of his closest advisors. The morale of his followers could easily crumble. But the presence of loyal friends, the timely support, and God's unseen guidance help sustain them. It's like a domino effect. Each act of loyalty, each small kindness, each piece of information contributes to the bigger picture. It all works together to ensure that David and his people make it through the wilderness safely. One of the principles we see here is that God provides support in tough times, often in ways we might not immediately recognize. It's not always dramatic or overt, but it's purposeful. The right people at the right time, encouragement when you're weary, provision when you're hungry, and information when you need to make decisions. These are all ways God shows his care. And it's humbling because it reminds us that even in our most vulnerable moments, we are not truly alone. There are forces at work, people being placed in our lives, sometimes in very subtle ways, to minister to us and to remind us that God is present. And isn't that just a beautiful truth when you feel like everything is collapsing, like your own family or community has betrayed you, like the weight of life is too much to carry? God often provides support through people, loyal friends, quiet acts of kindness, and the right advice at the right time. They're all instruments of his care. Just like he provided for David in the wilderness, he can provide for us in our own challenging seasons. And it's a reminder to us too, be that kind of person for someone else. Be the instrument of God's provision in someone's life when they're weary, lost, or overwhelmed. So as we continue with David's journeys, watch how these loyal friends operate. Notice their courage, their ingenuity, and their faithfulness. And notice how God's providence works through them to protect, sustain, and encourage David. It's a story that isn't just about battles and political maneuvering. It's about relationships, loyalty, timing, and God's faithful care in the midst of chaos. And for us, it's a principle we can carry into our own lives in tough times. God provides. He provides through people, through circumstances, and through his unseen hand guiding events in ways we might never fully understand, but that ultimately lead to safety, encouragement, and restoration. Okay. So now we get to one of the more tragic moments in this whole saga, and it's a stark contrast between human ambition and God's providence. Ahithophel, remember him, he was David's trusted advisor, the one whose counsel was almost always considered unerring. But here, in the midst of Absalom's rebellion, Ahithophel has switched sides, driven by bitterness and a desire for revenge. He gives Absalom this cunning, ruthless plan to strike at David immediately, while he's exhausted and vulnerable. On paper, it's brilliant, quick, decisive, devastating. Absalom thinks it's perfect, ready to wipe out his father's loyal followers and secure his new throne. And yet, things take a completely different turn. Hushai, David's loyal friend and mole in Absalom's camp, counters Ahithophel's advice. He advises caution, buying time for David to regroup. Hushai's plan appeals to Absalom's ego, praising him as a strong, capable leader who should gather all Israel before acting. Absalom, captivated by this flattery and seemingly wise counsel, chooses to follow Hushai instead. And that's where the story takes a divine twist. The text tells us that the Lord had intended to thwart Ahithophel's counsel, answering David's earlier prayer that the advice be turned into foolishness. It's subtle but powerful. God works through human decisions and even through deception to protect David and fulfill his purposes. Now, imagine being Ahithophel in that moment. He thought his plan was foolproof. He expected it to be followed immediately, a swift, decisive strike that would ensure Absalom's victory. But now, his advice is ignored. He realizes with sinking horror that the coup is not going to succeed. Everything he plotted for everything he hoped to achieve through cunning and strategy is falling apart. And it's in that crushing realization that Ahithophel makes the tragic decision to take his own life. He understands the stakes if Absalom fails. He will likely face execution for his betrayal. It's heartbreaking and sobering, the fall of a man whose wisdom and insight were legendary, yet whose motives were tainted by personal bitterness. There's a lot to unpack here. Ahithophel's death isn't just a shocking event, it's a vivid illustration of the contrast between human schemes and God's providence. Ahithophel relied on cunning, planning, and his own reputation to achieve his ends. He thought he could control the outcome through strategy alone, but God's plan was bigger, working behind the scenes in ways that Ahithophel could never anticipate. No matter how brilliant a scheme might appear on the surface, it cannot stand against God's providential design. The very plan that Ahithophel believed would secure power and revenge was turned into a tool of divine protection for David, who had prayed and trusted God to act. It's also a deeply human story about pride, resentment, and the consequences of turning wisdom into a weapon for personal gain. Ahithophel was wise, yes, but he let bitterness guide his decisions, and in doing so, his brilliance became his undoing. It's a powerful reminder that wisdom without humility and righteousness can lead to tragedy. One contrast that with David, who, though flawed, places his trust in God rather than in human schemes or immediate reactions. And the result, God intervenes in subtle but effective ways, protecting David and ensuring that his purposes are fulfilled. As we reflect on this, it's hard not to feel the weight of the moment. Ahithophel's end is sad, dramatic, and tragic, but it also reinforces a key lesson: human plans, no matter how clever or well executed, are ultimately limited. God's providence operates on a much higher plane. While people scheme, manipulate, and plot, God's hand is quietly, decisively moving events toward his intended outcome. Ahithophel thought he was in control. God had already written the next chapter. And there's a caution here for us, too. We live in a world full of plans, ambitions, and strategies. It's easy to believe that if we just outsmart everyone, if we just execute perfectly, we can control outcomes. But this story reminds us that control is an illusion. Trust, patience, and reliance on God are far more powerful than any scheme or human cleverness. While people may betray, manipulate, or act out of selfish ambition, God's providence works in ways we might not see, often through unexpected channels or to bring about his purposes. So when Ahithophel's advice is ignored and he takes his life, we see a tragic human outcome and a divine victory working side by side. It's a moment that feels personal, real, and painful, yet it carries a profound lesson about trust, patience, and God's control over the affairs of humans. It's a reminder that even when situations seem dire, when betrayal and human cunning are at work, God's providence remains unshaken, quietly shaping the path for His faithful. And it's not just abstract theology, it's practical and deeply human. Life is messy. People will make plans, betray, scheme, and manipulate. But like David, our hope and strength come from trusting that God is ultimately in control. Even in the middle of chaos, He is orchestrating events in ways that protect, guide, and fulfill His purposes, even when we can't immediately see how it's happening. Ahithophel's story is tragic, yes, but it's also a powerful testament to God's providence and the limitations of human power. It reminds us that ultimate control doesn't lie in clever strategies, force, or manipulation. It lies in trusting God and His timing, even when everything around us seems unstable, unpredictable, or downright threatening. Wow, what a chapter! Today we saw the importance of hearing both sides before making decisions, how critics and haters can attack but God defends us, and the incredible value of loyal friends who show up at just the right time. Plus, we witness God's providence quietly guiding events even when human plans seemed unstoppable. If you found these lessons meaningful, consider sticking around for more. There's so much ahead in David's journey, and you won't want to miss what happens next.